She believed she was loved. That was her first mistake, and the most expensive one she ever made. Luna Celine Hartwell stood at the center of a kingdom that never belonged to her, carrying a child whose father had already chosen someone else. She wasn't broken when she walked into that chamber. She was shattered after. There's a difference. And tonight, you're going to see exactly where one woman stopped bleeding and started burning. Stay until the end. Drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city you're watching from. I want to know who's out there in the dark with me. Odd. The celebration had been going on for 3 hours before Celine felt the first wrong note in the air. It came to her the way most truths did. Not as a sound, not as a word spoken plainly, but as a texture, a slight shift in the way the court moved around her. Ladies who normally fought for proximity to the Luna suddenly found reasons to exist on the far side of the hall. Advisors who had bowed to her for 4 years let their eyes slide past her face like she was a smudge on stone they couldn't be bothered to clean. She stood near the northern window of the grand celebration hall, her gold gown heavy against her swollen stomach, and she cataloged every small withdrawal the way a woman raised near the border territories learns to catalog the behavior of animals before a storm. Her mother had taught her that. Not court protocol, not how to smile through humiliation, how to read what the land was telling you before it turned. The land was telling her something now. "You look tired." Lady Mara appeared beside her, soft-voiced and careful the way people are when they're deciding whether to be kind or useful. Mara was one of the few genuinely harmless women in the court, harmless being a quality Celine had once mistaken for loyalty. "I'm fine. You've been standing alone for 40 minutes. I was born standing alone." Celine kept her eyes on the hall. "Where is he?" Mara's pause lasted 1 second too long. The king stepped away briefly. Affairs of state, I imagine. At his own celebration. He is the king. Celine finally looked at her. Mara's face was carefully composed, the way a person's face looks when they know more than they're saying and they're not sure they're brave enough to say it. She had kind eyes and weak hands, and she would never, not once, put herself between Celine and anything that hurt. "Thank you, Mara," Celine said. She meant it as a dismissal, and Mara understood it that way. The hall smelled of roasted meat and heated wax, and too many wolves packed into formal clothing, their natural musk pressed under layers of perfume and protocol. Celine was 26 years old and had been Luna of the Thorn Kingdom for 3 years, and she had learned to read this room the way she once read the frost-cracked soil of her home province. She knew when the musicians played faster because someone important was nervous. She knew which clusters of advisors meant financial trouble and which meant border skirmishes. She knew that Lord Castor laughed too loudly when he was afraid. Lord Castor was laughing very loudly tonight. She moved through the hall without announcing herself, nodding to the few courtiers who acknowledged her, keeping her pace easy and her face neutral. The baby shifted low and hard against her pelvis as she walked, and she breathed through it quietly, pressing one hand briefly against her side before dropping it again. She was 7 months along. She was exhausted in the particular way that was less about sleep and more about the sustained effort of being the only person in a room who hadn't been invited to know what was happening. She found the answer at the far end of the east corridor. The door to the royal private chamber, Darius's personal receiving room, sealed by custom from all guests during formal events, was not fully closed. A thin bar of amber candlelight fell across the stone floor of the corridor. Celine stopped 10 feet away and stood very still. She could hear 2 voices. She already knew one of them. She had known Darius Thorne's voice for 6 years, since he had ridden through the northern provinces choosing his Luna from among the daughters of allied pacts. She had heard that voice in his sleep, against her throat, bellowing battlefield orders from the Eastern Campaign. She knew its register when he was tired and its register when he was angry, and its register in the rare moments he allowed himself to be something other than a king. She knew, right now, that he was not tired and not angry. She crossed the remaining 10 feet and pushed the door open. The chamber was not large. Warm, well-appointed, everything in it chosen by someone with expensive taste and no warmth. Dark wood panels, a fire in the grate, a writing desk covered in documents that had not been touched tonight, a bottle of wine on the side table, 2 cups already used. Darius Thorne stood near the fireplace with Lady Vivian Ashford pressed against his chest, her pale hands fisted in his ceremonial jacket, her dark hair loose against his shoulder. He was not kissing her in that moment. He was simply holding her, his chin resting on the top of her head, his eyes closed, his expression the most unguarded thing Celine had ever seen on his face in 3 years of marriage. He looked like a man who was home. Nobody moved for several seconds. Then Darius opened his eyes and saw his wife standing in the doorway. He did not pull away from Vivian immediately. That was the detail that would stay with Celine longest afterward, through everything that came after. He saw her, and his expression shifted from that open, undefended thing into something closed and complicated. And then he stepped back from Vivian slowly, deliberately, like a man choosing his ground before a fight. Vivian turned. She was 31 and beautiful in the way rare things are beautiful. Precisely, deliberately, every element arranged for effect. She had been attached to Darius's court for 5 years. Celine had never liked her and had never been able to articulate why in terms the court would accept, because Vivian never did anything wrong in public. Vivian looked at Celine now with an expression that was not quite triumph and not quite pity. It was something more unsettling than either. It was patience, like a woman who had been waiting a long time for a particular moment to arrive and was simply noting that it had. "Celine," Darius's voice came out flat. Not guilty. Flat. She didn't say anything. "You weren't supposed to be in this corridor. I wasn't supposed to find you here," she said. Her own voice surprised her, steady. "That's not the same thing." Nothing happened. "Darius." "I said nothing happened." Something behind her eyes went very quiet. She had cried in front of him before, during the first miscarriage 2 years ago, when she had held the knowledge of it alone for 3 days before her body made denial impossible. She had cried, and he had been present for it, sitting at the edge of their bed with his hand on her back, saying nothing because he was a man who had never been taught what to do with female grief. She had thought at the time that his silence was the awkwardness of love. She understood now that it might simply have been the awkwardness of obligation. "How long?" she said. "This isn't the place." "How long, Darius?" Vivian moved toward the side table and lifted her wine cup with a composure that was, in its way, the most violent thing in the room. She took a small sip. She did not leave. Darius looked at his wife across the warm chamber, at her gold gown and her round stomach, and the particular stillness that had come over her face, and something moved through his expression. It might have been guilt. It might have been the first movement of shame. Whatever it was, it did not last. "You're making a scene. I'm standing in a doorway. Your presence here is inappropriate. This is a private chamber during a formal event." "It's your private chamber. I'm your wife." "My Luna," he said, and the word came out with a precision that told her he had chosen it deliberately, "has responsibilities during a formal event. Being here is not one of them." The distinction landed like a blade set down flat rather than swung. Not a cut, just a demonstration of what could be cut. Luna. Not wife. Not partner. The title. The function. Celine looked at him for a long moment. She looked at Vivian, who had finished her wine and set the cup down and was now examining the carved edge of the side table with apparent interest, performing disengagement so skillfully it almost obscured the listening. "I'm carrying your child," Celine said. "I'm aware." "Your heir." "I said I'm aware." "And this is what you—" She stopped, breathed. Her hand had moved without her permission to cover the swell of her stomach, the same protective reflex she'd developed sometime in the 5th month, when the baby started feeling real rather than theoretical. "This is who you choose." "No one is choosing anything tonight." Darius moved toward her, and his voice had shifted into the register she recognized from council chambers, the register that meant the conversation was being managed rather than had. "You're tired. You're in an emotional state. Go back to the hall, or go to your rooms, and we'll speak in the morning when—" "Don't." He stopped. "Don't use that voice with me," she said quietly. "Not tonight. You can do it tomorrow. You can probably do it for the rest of whatever this is. But not right now." Look at me right now and tell me what I'm seeing isn't what I'm seeing." He looked at her. His jaw was tight. He was 40 years old and had led 3 military campaigns and killed men with his hands, and standing in a private chamber looking at his pregnant wife, he looked, for just a moment, like someone who had run out of moves and was not accustomed to the feeling. Then Lord Castor appeared behind Celine in the doorway. Then 2 more council members. Then Lady Mara, white-faced and silent. Then, as if word had traveled through the hall with the speed that only scandal can achieve, a cluster of court observers whose presence meant the privacy of the moment was already dead. Celine became aware of the audience the way she had become aware of the wrong note earlier, as a texture, a change in pressure. She did not turn around. She kept her eyes on Darius and watched him become a king again in real time, watched the personal thing that had lived briefly in his face get folded away and replaced with political calculation. He straightened. He fixed his jacket. He looked past her to the gathered court, and his voice, when he spoke, was the voice of a man who had decided on his story. "My Luna has interrupted a private consultation in an agitated state," he said. "She has been under significant physical and emotional strain throughout this pregnancy, which we have all been sensitive to. Tonight's behavior is a reflection of that strain." Celine heard it happen. She heard the room accept it. Not loudly. The court was too trained for loud reactions. But she felt the shift, the same way she'd felt the shift earlier in the hall. The small collective adjustment as 40 people chose, in the span of a breath, to let the king's version of events become the one that was true. "Darius." Her voice came out even. She turned slightly so the room could hear her. "I walked into your private chamber during your own celebration and found your mistress in your arms. I am 7 months pregnant with your child. Those are the facts of this moment. Everyone present has just witnessed them." Silence. "Say something else true," she said. "I'll wait." His eyes went cold. She had seen that coldness before, during the Eastern Campaign dispatches, when messengers brought news of losses he had decided not to feel. She had told herself at the time that it was the particular coldness of a man who could not afford to feel certain things and remain functional. She understood now that some men were simply cold, and everything else was a story she had told herself to make it survivable. "Remove yourself from this corridor," he said quietly, "before I have you escorted." "On what grounds?" "Disruption of a state event. Hysterical behavior unbecoming a Luna." "I have not raised my voice once." "Celine." The word landed like a closed door. She looked at him. She looked at Vivian, who had moved to stand slightly behind Darius's shoulder, her face arranged in an expression of composed concern that managed to be simultaneously sympathetic and devastating. She looked at the council members, Castor and Renwick and old Lord Farah, and she watched them watch her, and she understood, with a clarity she would not fully process for hours, that none of them were going to say a single thing, not one. They had all known, or suspected, or chosen not to know in the deliberate way that is its own form of knowledge. And now they were going to stand in a corridor with candlelight flickering against stone and watch a pregnant woman be dismissed, and none of them were going to open their mouths. Something shifted inside her. It was not rage. Not yet. It was closer to the sensation of a structure giving way, like the sound a floorboard makes before it breaks, but felt in the chest rather than heard with the ears. She had built her entire existence in this kingdom on the premise that her position meant something real, that the vows were actual vows and not political theater, that the child she was carrying was wanted by both its parents, that the 3 years of navigating this court and managing these alliances and absorbing these small humiliations as the cost of love rather than the evidence of contempt had accumulated into something that could not simply be reframed as hysterical behavior in a corridor. She had built on that premise the way people build on stone, not understanding until the stone moved that it was not stone at all. She turned and walked back down the corridor. She heard Darius say something low to someone behind her. She heard Vivian's murmured response. She heard the court exhale, and she heard in that exhale all the things they would say to each other in quiet rooms tomorrow. Poor creature, unfortunate situation, what a shame she can't manage herself. And she walked through it the way you walk through cold water, not fast, not panicked, one foot and then the other. She did not go back to the hall. She went to her rooms and she stood in the center of them, and she pressed both hands against her stomach and she breathed. The baby moved, a slow, rolling push against the inside of her palm. She stood very still and felt it. Her mother had told her, the week before Celine left the Northern Territories to become Luna of the Thorn Kingdom, that power was not what they told you it was. They will tell you power is what you hold over people, her mother had said, crouching in the frost-killed garden with dirt on her hands and her gray hair coming loose. That's not power. Power is what you're willing to lose and survive anyway. At the time, Celine had thought this was the kind of thing people said to make loss sound noble. She was starting to understand it differently. She changed out of the gold gown. Not frantically, methodically, the way she did everything when she was fighting to stay functional. She unhooked the back herself, let it fall, stepped out of it, left it on the floor. She put on the plain dark riding clothes she kept in the back of the wardrobe, the ones her maid always asked about and she always deflected, because she had kept them since the day she arrived in this palace and had never been able to fully articulate why, except that she had always known, somewhere in the untranslatable deep part of herself, that there might come a night when she needed to be able to move quickly. She tied her hair back. She pulled on her boots. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and let herself think. Vivian Ashford had been in Darius's life for 5 years. 5 years meant she was there before Celine. 5 years meant there were people in this court who had watched Celine walk down the ceremonial aisle 3 years ago, knowing exactly what she was walking into. 5 years meant the whole performance of the courtship, the selection, the vows, the Luna ceremony with its old forms and its bound wrists and its blood-price promises. All of it had happened alongside something Celine was never meant to know about. She did the arithmetic on her pregnancy without wanting to. 7 months back was the Bloodspring Festival, when Darius had come to her rooms with actual warmth in his face, which was rare enough that she had noted it and been grateful. She had told herself then that something between them had shifted toward closeness, that the pregnancy announced 2 weeks later was a sign of something healing. She sat with the arithmetic for 30 seconds and then put it away because there was nothing to do with it yet. She thought about the council members standing in that corridor. Castor, Renwick, Farah. Old wolves, court wolves, men who had served 3 Thorn Kings and survived by knowing which way every wind blew before it turned. They had been there. They had heard the exchange. They had watched Darius call his pregnant Luna hysterical, and not one of them had, not a word, not a look, nothing. That was the detail that frightened her more than Vivian. Not the betrayal itself, but the infrastructure around it. The silence that wasn't spontaneous but organized. The court that hadn't retreated from her tonight because they didn't know what was happening, they'd retreated because they did. She was still sitting there when she heard the voices outside her door. 2 guards. She recognized neither voice, which meant they were not her regular detail. Her regular detail had been assigned to her on the first month of her pregnancy by the king's own order, men she had worked with, spoken with, whose families she knew by name. She went to the door and listened. Luna is to remain in her chambers until the king sends for her. On whose order? Lord Castor relays the king's instruction. And if she asks to see the king herself? A pause. Then, she is to be informed that the king is not to be disturbed this evening. She is to remain, for her own well-being. Celine stepped back from the door. For her own well-being. She stood in the center of her room and looked at the walls of it. At the tapestries she had not chosen, and the furniture she had not chosen, and the window that looked north over a kingdom she had been brought to serve. At the gold gown on the floor like a shed skin. At the riding boots on her feet. She thought about what she was. Not what they called her, not the title, not the function. What she actually was. She was a woman from the northern provinces who had spent 3 years becoming everything this court needed her to be. And she had done it with a thoroughness that had cost her in ways she hadn't fully tallied yet. And she was carrying a child who was going to be used as a mechanism of succession by people who had never intended to protect either of them. And the door of her chamber was now guarded by men she did not know, following orders she had not been consulted about. She went to the window. The palace grounds stretched north in the thin winter moonlight. Beyond the formal gardens, the stable complex. Beyond the stables, the outer wall, which had a service gate that the kitchen staff used before dawn. She knew this because she had walked those grounds obsessively during the early months of her pregnancy when she couldn't sleep, and obsessive walking had always been her form of learning. She looked at the door. She looked at the window. She went to the small writing table in the corner and opened the lower drawer. She kept almost nothing personal in this room. She'd learned early that personal objects in a court are leverage for other people. But there was one thing. A folded letter from her mother, 2 years old now, that she had never destroyed because she could not bring herself to. She put it inside her jacket. She went to the wardrobe and found the small travel pack she had kept there since month 4 of the pregnancy for a reason she had called being cautious and understood now was something closer to being ready. She picked up the pack. She stood for a moment in the center of the room, then she walked to the fireplace. The fire was low but still living, red coals under a thin gray ash. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at the gold gown on the floor. She picked it up. It weighed more than she expected, heavily beaded, sewn through with silver thread, the kind of thing that cost more than most wolves in the northern provinces earned in a year. She held it over the fire until the hem caught. Then she set it on the hearthrug and watched it spread. She did not stop there. She was not sure afterward that she had made a conscious decision at any specific point. It was more that something had cracked open in her chest when Darius's voice had come out cold and measured in that corridor. And once a thing like that cracks, the pressure finds its own way out. She pulled the heavy tapestry down from the eastern wall and fed its edge into the growing fire. She toppled the decorative oil lamp from the side table and watched the oil run, finding grooves in the stone floor. She moved to the writing desk and added the documents there. Nothing personal. Only the official correspondence she'd been copying and signing for 3 years as part of the Luna's administrative function. And she watched the court's paperwork begin to char. By the time the smoke reached the gap beneath the door, the room was genuinely ablaze. She was already at the window. The drop to the lower terrace was 15 feet. In her current state, it was not ideal. She lowered herself as far as she could before releasing, landed hard on both feet and one palm, felt the impact travel up her spine and jar something deep and uncomfortable. She knelt on the cold stone, breathing carefully, waiting for anything in her body to report serious damage. The baby kicked, harder than the rolling push from earlier, twice, in rapid succession, like punctuation. "I know," she said quietly. "I know. Give me a moment." She got to her feet and moved toward the stables. Behind her, through the palace wall, she could already hear shouting. The fire had taken faster than she'd calculated. She heard the alarm tone begin. 3 long bells, pausing, 3 long bells, and she did not slow down. The stables were half dark and smelling of hay and warm animal. She went to the 3rd stall, where her own horse was kept, a northern-bred gray mare she had named Nothing because naming things in this court had always felt like creating liabilities. She saddled her in the dark with hands that shook slightly, and then did not. The service gate was unlocked. It was never locked before the kitchen runs began, and the kitchen runs began at 4 in the morning, and it was now just past midnight. She pushed it open, led the mare through, and stood for a moment on the outside of the palace wall with the winter air cutting cold through her jacket, and the alarm bells still sounding, and the sky over the eastern wing beginning to show the orange reflection of a substantial fire. She had set fire to the royal chamber. She was 7 months pregnant. She had 30 coins in her pack, 3 days of travel food, a letter from her mother, and the riding clothes on her back. She thought of Darius's face in the moment before the court appeared in the doorway, that brief, undefended expression she had seen him wearing with Vivienne, the face she had spent 3 years trying to earn. She thought of what it meant that she had seen it, finally, on a night that had nothing to do with her. She mounted the mare slowly, one hand on the pommel, breathing through the effort, and straightened in the saddle. Behind her, the bells were still ringing, and the orange light was growing in the east, and she could hear, faintly, voices multiplying in the palace grounds as people came out to see what was burning. She turned north. She pressed her heels to the mare's flanks, and she rode. She had been on the road for perhaps 2 hours, following the old trade route by moonlight, when she heard the first horses behind her. Not travelers. Too fast, too coordinated, moving in a pattern she recognized from the border patrols she had reviewed in her first year as Luna. 3 riders, maybe 4, spread across the road width to cut off a lateral escape. They were already hunting her. She leaned forward over the mare's neck and urged her faster, and the night opened up cold and absolute on either side of the road. and she felt something settle in her chest that was not calm and not fear, but some third thing she had no name for yet. Whatever it was, it felt more honest than anything she had felt in 3 years. She rode harder into the dark, carrying the last thorn air inside her body, like a secret the kingdom had not yet figured out it needed to destroy. She didn't know yet that the hunters behind her were the least of it. She didn't know what Vivian Ashford had already set in motion. She didn't know what the council had already agreed to. She didn't know the specific, careful architecture of what had been built around her for longer than she could imagine, using her presence and her pregnancy and her careful, trusting compliance as material. She didn't know any of it yet. But the North was ahead of her, and the fire was behind her, and she was still riding. That was enough for now. The horses behind her were gaining. Celine knew it the way she knew most things now, but not through calculation, but through the body's older math. The vibration in the road, the way her mare's ears tracked backward despite the forward push. 3 riders, maybe 4, and they were not traveling. They were working. She had maybe a quarter mile on them. She took the first fork north without slowing, cutting off the main trade route onto a secondary track she remembered from the territorial maps she had memorized 2 years ago during the Luna's administrative review. The maps had been presented to her as a formality. Here is your kingdom. Here are its roads. Here are its borders. She had studied them with the specific thoroughness of a woman who had grown up near a border and understood that knowing the land was not optional. The secondary track ran northeast through the first of the pine stands, where the canopy would close out the moonlight. She pushed the mare into the trees and let the dark swallow them. She stopped moving and listened. The hoofbeats on the main road slowed. She heard voices, low, functional, the voices of men solving a problem rather than pursuing a target. One of them said something about the fork. Another responded. A pause. Then 2 of them continued north on the main road and 1 turned onto the secondary track. Celine breathed carefully. 1 she could manage. 1 she could maybe lose in the trees or outrun if she needed to, though the mare was beginning to show the labor of a 2-hour push, and Celine's own body had been registering the ride in ways she was choosing to set aside until later. She moved deeper into the pines, slower now, keeping her pace quiet against the frozen ground, and let the tracker commit to the track before she cut east. He was good. She would give him that. He adjusted twice before she lost him at the creek crossing where the water was still running cold and fast enough to cut scent, and she pushed the mare through it without stopping, feeling the icy water soak through her boots and close like a fist around her ankles. She did not make a sound. On the far bank she stopped again, shaking badly now from cold and exertion, and pressed her hand against her stomach. The baby was still. Not the bad still. She was learning the difference between the baby sleeping and the baby waiting. And this felt like waiting, like the child inside her had inherited something of her own particular quality of stillness under pressure. "We're all right," she said quietly. She wasn't sure which of them she was telling. She rode through the rest of the night at a walk, covering ground slowly, navigating by the few stars visible through the cloud cover. By the time the sky began to gray in the east, she had put roughly 18 miles between herself and the palace, and her body had begun sending requests she could no longer defer. She found a hollow in the tree line off the track, sheltered on 3 sides, and stopped. She dismounted badly. Her legs didn't cooperate the way she needed them to, and she came down harder than she intended, catching herself with one hand against the mare's flank. She stood there for a moment, forehead pressed against the horse's neck, breathing. Then she made a fire. Small, positioned carefully, the way her grandfather had taught her before she was old enough to understand why. Not for warmth primarily, though she needed warmth. For the particular grounding effect of a physical task with concrete steps when everything else is in freefall. She ate without tasting what she ate. She changed her wet socks with the spare pair in the pack. She lay down on her side in the hollow, with the mare between her and the wind, and she did not sleep, but she rested, which was a different thing, and she let herself do the accounting she had been deferring since she left the palace window. What she knew, Darius had a mistress of years' standing whose presence in the court had been an open secret to everyone except, apparently, his Luna. The council had been present for her humiliation and chosen silence. The chamber guard sent to her rooms had not been her regular detail. She had been placed under what amounted to soft house arrest within an hour of the incident, before anyone could reasonably have assessed her as a flight risk. That last piece was the one that mattered most. The speed of it, the coordination. Castor relaying instructions before Celine had even returned to her rooms. That wasn't a response to her behavior in the corridor. That was a prepared position. Someone had been waiting for a trigger event, something that could be framed as instability, and they had moved on it with a readiness that suggested they had been ready for some time. She thought about her pregnancy. She thought about the 7 months of careful management she had received from the royal physician, the medicines she had been given for the nausea, the enforced rest, the gentle but persistent guidance toward reduced activity and social withdrawal. She had attributed it to medical caution. She was now applying a different frame to it and not liking what it built. Someone had wanted her contained. Someone had wanted her credibility eroded. A Luna who was unstable, emotional, physically fragile, dependent. Someone had been building a version of Celine Hartwell that the court would believe could shatter in a corridor and set a room on fire. She stared at the small fire and felt something cold settle into her, thinking that had nothing to do with the temperature. They were not just trying to remove her. They were trying to own what she was carrying. She slept for 3 hours. She woke to the sound of hoofbeats on the main track and was on her feet before she was fully conscious, hand on the mare's nose to keep her quiet, standing motionless in the hollow while 2 riders passed on the track 20 feet away. Royal livery, moving east to west, sweeping back. They passed without slowing. She waited until she couldn't hear them anymore, then waited 10 minutes after that. Then she moved north again. By the second night, she had crossed into the outer territories, the loose buffer land between the Thorn Kingdom's formal borders and the no-man's wilderness that the court called the Northern Expanse, and the people who actually lived there called home. The settlements here were small, self-sufficient, largely indifferent to who sat the throne in the capital. She had visited twice in her capacity as Luna, distributing the ceremonial provisions that were supposed to build loyalty and mostly just built the appearance of it. She found a way station on the third night, a traveler's shelter maintained by custom rather than law, the kind that existed in frontier territories because the alternative was people dying in the cold. And even wolves who wanted nothing to do with kingdoms didn't want that on their conscience. She pushed the door open and stopped. A fire was already burning. A man sat on the far side of it, eating something from a clay bowl, and he looked up at her without any particular surprise. He was somewhere in his middle 30s, heavily built, with the particular quality of stillness that comes not from calm but from economy. Someone who had learned not to move unless movement was necessary. He had a scar running from his left eyebrow to the corner of his jaw, old enough to have gone white, and he was wearing the kind of gear that said he had been sleeping in the cold long enough that warmth was a resource he managed rather than assumed. She recognized him. Kyle Draven, former alpha of the Westmark Pack. Exiled by Darius's decree 4 years ago, the public grounds being insubordination during the Eastern Campaign. The real grounds being something the court had never stated plainly and she had never been in a position to investigate. He looked at her stomach and then back at her face, and his expression did not change. "Close the door," he said. "You're letting the cold in." She closed the door. She did not come further inside. "You know who I am," she said. "Luna of the Thorn Kingdom." He took another bite. "Former, I'm guessing, given the circumstances." "What circumstances?" "You're alone. You're traveling at night. You're 7 months pregnant, on horseback, in the Northern Expanse in winter." He set the bowl down. "And I watched 2 palace hunter teams pass through this area this morning, asking about a woman, northern-born, they said, riding a gray mare." She said nothing. "They didn't come in here," he said. "I don't advertise. Sit down before you fall down. You've been in the saddle most of the past 72 hours, and your body's done more work than you're admitting to yourself. You have no particular reason to help me." "True. And some reason not to. I'm a wanted woman. Returning me to the palace would probably—" "I'm an exiled alpha," Kale said flatly. "I have approximately no leverage with the Thorn Court, regardless of what I carry to them. Sit down." She calculated the room. The door was behind her. He was across the fire, which was not negligible distance, and she was in better condition than her body was currently suggesting. He had not moved toward her. He had not moved at all. She sat down. "There's food," he said, nodding toward the pot on the fire's edge. I'm not here to eat your food. Then why are you here? I needed shelter for one night. You need more than that. He looked at her directly, not with the assessing look she was used to from the court, cataloging her value, her presentation, her usefulness, but with the look of someone counting actual facts. You're dehydrated. You're running a low temperature. Your hands haven't stopped shaking since you walked in. She looked at her hands. He was right. Eat something, he said, not as an offer, as information. She ate. It was plain food, grain, dried meat, something root-based she couldn't identify. And she ate all of it without speaking, and he let her, which she noted. Most people filled silence reflexively. He seemed constitutionally disinterested in filling it. When she finished, she set the bowl down and looked at him across the fire. Why were you exiled? She said. Insubordination during the Eastern campaign. That's what the decree said. Yes. I'm asking what actually happened. He was quiet for a moment. He put another piece of wood on the fire, and she watched him do it with the same deliberate economy he seemed to apply to everything. I told Darius that the eastern villages he was burning weren't harboring insurgents, Kael said. I told him the intelligence was fabricated. I told him who fabricated it and why. He had me removed from command and exiled before I could put those words in front of anyone who would act on them. Who fabricated it? He looked at her steadily. Lord Castor, in cooperation with the woman your husband was with last night. Celine went very still. You knew, she said. I knew about Castor and the intelligence. I suspected the rest. And you've been here. For 4 years. Where else would I go? It wasn't a question. You could have... She stopped. Because he couldn't have, actually. He was exiled. He had no pack, no territory, no standing. An exiled alpha appearing at the borders of any allied kingdom would be either turned away or handed back. The Eastern campaign had been 4 years ago. She had reviewed its victory records in her first year as Luna. 3 eastern villages pacified. A border insurgency crushed. The king's decisive action praised by the council. Villages that an alpha commander had told the king were not harboring insurgents. She sat with this and felt the thing she had been building in her mind since the way station fire take on more structure. Not a betrayal, an architecture. Something that had been under construction for years, using multiple tools. Castor's political maneuvering, Vivian's proximity to the king, the systematic removal of anyone who might complicate the plan. They needed him isolated, she said, mostly to herself, dependent on the people around him, convinced that his own instincts were wrong. Kael said nothing, which she was beginning to understand was his way of agreeing. The child, she said, they need the child to be born under specific circumstances, without a credible Luna, without anyone who would... She stopped again, pressing her hand flat against her stomach. The succession laws, Kael said quietly. If the Luna is declared unfit before the birth, custody of the heir reverts to the council's appointed regent until the child reaches majority. That's 17 years of a regent managing the throne on a child king's behalf. 17 years. She thought of Castor laughing loudly in the hall. She thought of the palace physician's gentle, persistent guidance toward rest and reduced engagement. She thought of Vivian's patient expression in the chamber doorway, that composure that had read as triumph but was actually something far more controlled. They hadn't been waiting for Celine to fail. They had been building her failure, piece by piece, year by year, with the patience of people who understood that the most reliable trap was one the target assembled herself from materials she believed were her own life. I need to know everything you know, she said. Kael looked at her for a long moment. His face was not easy to read. It had the quality of a surface that had been weathered past the point of easy interpretation, where what was underneath required attention to find. That's a considerable ask, he said. I'm aware. You're asking an exiled alpha to commit what amounts to treason against the sitting king by sharing intelligence with his fugitive Luna. Yes, and your argument for why I should. Because you already committed the treason 4 years ago when you told the truth, she said. You've been paying the price of it since. The only question is whether you paid it for nothing or whether it eventually means something. He was quiet. And because they tried to build a cage around my child before it was even born, she said. Her voice came out flat and certain. And I will burn down everything that exists within reach before I let that stand. So you can help me understand what I'm burning, or I walk out of here and burn it blind. Outside, the wind moved through the pine stands with a sound like water. The fire popped and settled. Sit closer to the fire, Kyle said finally. You're still shaking, and this is going to take a while. She moved closer. She did not thank him. He did not expect her to. He began to talk. What she heard in the next 2 hours rewrote every assumption she had carried into the palace on her wedding day and had carefully maintained since. The way you maintain a belief not because the evidence supports it, but because the alternative is too structurally destabilizing to look at directly. Vivian Ashford had been Castor's instrument for 7 years. Introduced to Darius deliberately, cultivated as a dependency, and used to feed a slow and careful erosion of the king's confidence in his own counsel, his allies, his instincts. Not to destroy him, to make him manageable. A king who doubted himself was a king who needed advisors he trusted, and Castor had spent 7 years becoming the most trusted man in that room. 2 previous deaths in the Thorn Court, a former advisor and the king's brother, both ruled natural, had been, according to what Kyle had pieced together from sources he did not name, neither natural nor accidental. And Celine's pregnancy had not been the beginning of the plan. It had been the trigger that activated a prepared conclusion. She sat with this, and she did not cry. She had cried everything available to her somewhere on the road north, in the dark between the pine stands, and what was left was the other thing. The cold, structural thing that was becoming, slowly and without sentiment, the foundation of what she intended to do. I need to recover, she said when he finished. I need to be at full capacity before the blood moon coronation. That's 4 months. Yes. He looked at her steadily. You're planning to go back. I'm planning to end it. Alone. I was alone when I started. Outside, she heard it before Kyle did. The distant rhythm of multiple riders, more than 2, moving in organized spread across the northern approach. Not the sweeping pattern of a search, the converging pattern of a net. They had found her. Kyle was already on his feet, and she was already reading the room, and there was no back door to the way station, and only one window, and the horses were outside, and the riders were close enough now that she could hear individual voices cutting through the wind. She looked at Kyle. He looked at her. There is a tunnel under the firebox, he said. Dug 3 years ago. It comes out in the creek bed, 50 yards north. He was moving as he spoke, pulling the firebox grate aside with the matter-of-fact speed of a man who had planned for exactly this. Your mare is tied on the east side. I'll come out the door. I'll give you time. They'll take you. They'll try. His eyes met hers briefly, flat and without drama. Go. She went. On her hands and knees through cold, dark earth, 50 yards of it, the baby pressing against the tunnel floor as she moved, her elbows and knees finding every rock, breathing in the close, dark air through her nose, because panic was not an option she had available. She came out in the creek bed with ice water around her knees, and the voices of the hunters 20 yards to the west, and Kyle's voice carrying clearly from the way station door, unhurried and almost bored, saying something about a woman. Yes, she'd passed through, heading west toward the Ashwood, maybe an hour ago. She did not wait to hear more. She found the mare, untied her with numb fingers, and walked north through the creek bed until the voices faded, and then she mounted and she rode. Kyle had just lied to the king's hunters for her. She didn't know yet whether to call that loyalty or strategy or something else entirely. She didn't know what he wanted in return, or whether he understood that she would not be the same woman who had walked into a court at 23 expecting love to be sufficient armor. She knew she was not going back to anything she had left. She was riding towards something that didn't exist yet, and she was going to build it from whatever the North would give her, and from whatever she had left after the fire, and from the particular cold intelligence of a woman who had finally, completely, run out of things to lose. She pressed her heels to the mare's flanks. The North opened up ahead of her, dark and absolute. She did not look back. 3 months passed the way hard things pass. Not quickly, not slowly, but with the particular weight of time that is being used rather than endured. Celine learned the northern expanse the way she had learned everything that mattered in her life. by necessity, and then by choice, and then by something that stopped needing a name because it had become part of how she moved through the world. She learned which settlements would ask no questions and which would ask the wrong ones. She learned the creek routes and the ridge lines and the 3 passes through the upper territories that the palace hunters didn't know existed because they had never been stationed here long enough to learn the land rather than just cross it. Kyle had found her 2 days after the way station. He had appeared on the ridge above her campfire at dawn without announcement, leading his own horse and carrying a pack that suggested he had not gone back for anything. And he had looked at her across the distance the way he looked at most things, as a fact to be assessed rather than a problem to be solved. And she had looked back at him and said nothing, and he had come down off the ridge, and that had been the beginning of it. They did not discuss terms. There was an understanding between them that operated below the level of language, the understanding of 2 people who have both been discarded by the same system and have independently reached the conclusion that survival requires a different set of rules than the ones they were handed. He taught her things. Not gently, not apologetically, not with the careful management of a man worried about a pregnant woman's feelings. He taught her the way the North taught everything, by showing her once and expecting her to apply it, and correcting her when she didn't without softening the correction. She learned to track. She learned to read weather and the tree behavior before it arrived. She learned which roots were edible in winter and which would make her sick and which would make her dead. She learned slowly to stop flinching at the sound of horses on distant roads. Her body, which had been staging a prolonged argument with the demands she was placing on it, eventually arrived at something like accommodation. The baby settled lower in her 8th month, and she moved differently after that. Not slower, just differently, with a shift in her center that changed her balance and required her to rebuild habits she had only recently established. She rebuilt them. She thought about Darius less than she expected. This surprised her, and then it didn't. What she had loved, she was increasingly understanding, was not the man himself but the premise. The idea that a woman from the northern provinces could walk into the seat of power and be seen clearly and chosen accurately and not used as a structural element in someone else's plan. The man had always been secondary to the premise. The premise was what had died in the corridor. Darius was just the evidence. What she thought about instead, in the long hours of cold and movement and Kyle's particular brand of silent company, was the architecture, the construction of what Castor and Vivian had built. She turned it over the way you turn a stone to find what's underneath, looking for the seams, the places where the structure was load-bearing and the places where it was decorative, the points where removing a single piece would bring sections down. She had one asset that they did not know she had: Kyle's 4 years of exile work. He had not spent those years in bitterness. He had spent them building a network of intelligence among the border settlements, the rogue packs, the wolves the kingdom had marginalized or expelled over 2 decades of Thorn rule. He knew things. He knew who owed what to whom, which council members were operating under coercion and which under genuine ambition, which of the royal deaths had been investigated and by whom and why those investigations had stopped. He knew, specifically, about a sealed document in the palace archive, a confession from a council secretary who had died 6 months after writing it, that detailed 3 meetings between Castor, Vivian, and the assassin responsible for the king's brother's death. That document was what Celine needed. Everything else was argument. That was proof. The plan they built was not elegant. Elegance was for people who had margin. Their plan was functional, load-bearing, calibrated to the specific vulnerabilities of the Blood Moon coronation, the one night of the year when the palace opened its gates to delegations from every allied pack, when the court's normal security architecture was loosened to accommodate diplomacy, when the king was required by custom to be publicly accessible in ways that made certain private arrangements impossible. She would enter with the Duskfall delegation. Old Alpha Rena of Duskfall had been her mother's ally and had never liked Darius and had, through Kyle's network, quietly indicated that she might be persuaded to provide cover for a woman she respected, returning to correct a wrong that offended her. She would access the archive through the East Passage that the kitchen staff used for supply deliveries, which connected, 3 turns in, to the administrative wing where the archive sat. She would be in and out before the coronation ceremony reached its 2nd hour. And then, standing before every delegation of every allied pack with the confession in her hands, she would end it. It was a good plan. She had turned it from every angle. She had accounted for the hunters, for the guard rotation, for the likely positions of Castor's private security. She had war-gamed the confrontation itself until she could run it in her sleep. She had not accounted for Mira. Mira was 19 and had been with the northern settlement for 2 years, a runaway from a collapsed southern pack who had built herself a place here through hard work and a quality of bright, direct warmth that was rare enough in the expanse to be notable. Celine had trusted her with small things first, then larger things, then finally with the bones of the plan itself, because Mira was going to be her contact inside the Duskfall delegation, the person who would confirm the archive access window and pass the timing signal. She had trusted Mira because Mira reminded her of who she herself had been at 19, before the court, before the years of learning that warmth was not the same as loyalty. She had forgotten that lesson at exactly the wrong moment. Celine was 4 days out from the capital when Kael found her on the road at midday, riding fast from the wrong direction, and she knew from his face before he spoke. "Mira," he said. She felt it close in her chest like a fist. "How much?" "Enough. The archive access route, the Duskfall delegation cover, the timing." He pulled his horse alongside hers. "She went to Castor's man in the border settlement 3 days ago. I found out this morning." "Why?" "Her pack. The southern collapse. Her alpha is still alive. Castor has him. She had a choice between you and him." Celine looked at the road ahead. The capital was 4 days north. The Blood Moon coronation was in 5 days. Everything she had built over 3 months now had a hole in it that Castor's people were already filling. "The archive route is burned," she said. "Yes." "The Duskfall cover is burned. Rena will be watched from the moment her delegation enters the gates. Using her now puts her people at risk and gains us nothing." "The timing window?" "Burned. They'll change the rotation." She sat with this for a moment. The cold was absolute today, the kind that got into the joints and stayed. She was 38 weeks pregnant and had been on horseback for 7 hours, and her plan had just been gutted by a 19-year-old girl who had been trying to save someone she loved. She could not, holding that specific fact, find room for hatred. She could find plenty of room for the other thing. The cold, clear-eyed acknowledgement that sentiment had just cost her everything she had spent 3 months building, and that she was now 4 days from a confrontation she no longer had the infrastructure to survive, and that the choice in front of her was not a good choice and a bad choice, but a bad choice and a worse one. "She told them I have the document," Celine said. "She doesn't know about the document. I never told her that piece." Something loosened slightly. "What does she know about the document?" "Nothing concrete. She knows you have evidence of the conspiracy. She doesn't know what form it takes or where it came from." That was something. That was potentially enough. "Then they'll spend resources trying to find what I have instead of discrediting it," she said. "They'll spend resources watching Rena's delegation instead of the ones they're not watching." Kael looked at her. "I need a different entry point," she said. "I need a different access route, and I need to move in 2 days instead of 4. You're 38 weeks. I'm aware." "Celine." "I'm aware, Kael." She looked at him directly. "I don't have 4 days anymore. I have 2 before they fully lock down the approaches and the palace goes to closed access protocol ahead of the coronation. 2 days is enough time if I move now. If I wait for the conditions to be better, there will not be a coronation to interrupt. Castor will have moved on whatever alternative plan he's had in reserve since the moment he found out I was still alive." Kael was quiet. He had the look he got when he was running calculations that he didn't like the results of. "The South Servants' Passage," he said finally. "There's a wool merchant named Dort who delivers to the palace 3 times yearly. His next delivery is in 2 days. He owes me a significant debt, and he is not a man who likes owing debts. Can he get me inside? He can get you as far as the lower storage levels. After that, you're navigating the palace on your own knowledge. I know the palace. You knew it 7 months ago. They've had 7 months to change things. Some things don't change. The archive is in the same building it's been in for 40 years. The East Administrative Corridor connects to it from the north end. The north end connects to the ceremonial approach." She paused. "I need 1 person inside." One person who's been there recently and who Castor's people haven't identified. Kale looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Lady Mara. Celine went still. She reached out through my network 6 weeks ago, he said. She didn't know it was my network. She was looking for information about you, whether you were still alive. Why? Because she's been watching what's happened in that court since the night you left, and she's made a decision. His jaw tightened slightly. She was at the corridor. She saw everything and said nothing. I think she's been paying the price of that in her own way. Guilt is not the same as reliability. No, but guilt combined with the specific knowledge that Castor has been systematically removing people who might speak against him. 2 court ladies dismissed in the past month, both of whom were known to have been close to you, has a way of concentrating a person's thinking. Celine thought about Mara's face in the corridor, the white composure of a woman who knew exactly what she was watching and had calculated, in the span of a second, that she lacked the courage to stand against it. She thought about Mara appearing beside her at the celebration saying, "You've been standing alone for 40 minutes, which was its own small form of witness. Weak hands, but hands nonetheless. Get me a message to her, Celine said. Tonight. They made camp off the road, and Celine sat by the fire with her back against a pine and her hands flat against her stomach, and she did what she had been doing since the way station. She rebuilt. The plan was not dead. The plan had lost its infrastructure and needed new infrastructure, and she had 2 days to construct it, and she was exhausted in every layer of her body down to the marrow, and the baby was pressing against her lungs when she breathed deeply, and she was going to do it anyway. She thought about Mira. She did not think about her with bitterness. Bitterness would have been easier in some ways. It was a clean emotion, directional. It gave you somewhere to put the energy. What she felt instead was more complicated and more useful. She felt the confirmation of something she had been learning since the night in the corridor, that everyone had a price that wasn't money. Everyone had a lever. And the people who ran systems of power, Castor, Vivian, the whole apparatus, were people who had learned to find those levers and use them. And the reason they kept winning was that the people they were using were still operating on the assumption that human loyalty was a matter of character rather than circumstance. Celine had operated on that assumption. She was not going to operate on it anymore. This was not the death of something in her. She was clear about that, sitting by the fire with the cold coming down and the trees standing black against the last of the light. It was not the death of the capacity to trust or to be moved by someone else's pain or to understand why a 19-year-old girl had made the choice she made. Those things were still present. She could feel them. What was different was that they no longer had executive authority. They would not make her decisions for her. They would inform her decisions. She would understand the lever, and she would account for it, and she would make choices that could withstand the application of pressure without collapsing. She had been soft clay in that court. She had believed that being soft was the same as being open, and being open was the same as being honest, and being honest would be recognized and valued. She understood now that softness was only safe when the structure around you was safe. When the structure was predatory, softness was just a shape that was easy to press into whatever form the predator needed. She was not soft clay anymore. Kale returned to camp at midnight with word that Mara had received the message and sent back 2 words. Tell me. Celine looked at those 2 words for a long time. Then she said, Tomorrow we move. She stood up, and the baby shifted hard and low, and she breathed through it, and she looked north toward the capital she had fled 7 months ago, carrying nothing but a letter from her mother and 30 coins, and the particular cold intelligence of a woman who had run out of things to lose. She had gained things since then. Knowledge, capability, the specific load-bearing kind of clarity that only comes from having everything you thought was solid turn out to be constructed from other people's convenience. She had one more thing to gain. She needed to get inside that palace. She needed to reach that archive. She needed to stand in front of the assembled court of the Blood Moon coronation and put the confession in front of every allied alpha who had ever sworn loyalty to a throne that had been quietly rotting from within. And she needed to do it before Castor realized that burning her original plan had not burned her. She needed to do it before he understood what she had actually become out here in the cold and the dark. She needed to do it before he figured out that the woman who had ridden away from a burning chamber 7 months ago carrying grief and a child was not the woman who was now riding back. She pressed her heels to the mare's flanks. The capital waited ahead, 4 days north. She was going to arrive in 2. The wool merchant's cart smelled of lanolin and damp burlap, and the particular sourness of a man who had been afraid for 2 days straight. Dort didn't speak to her. Kael had explained the terms of the debt, and Dort had gone pale and nodded and asked no questions, which was exactly the quality Celine needed from him. She lay in the bed of the cart beneath a layer of pressed fleece, breathing through her mouth, feeling every stone in the road translate through the cart boards into her spine. The baby was engaged low and still. She was 39 weeks. She had been having intermittent contractions for 6 hours that she was choosing to classify as preparatory rather than active. She was choosing this with a conviction she did not entirely feel. Mara had come through. 2 nights ago, in a cold room at the edge of a border settlement, Celine had looked at Lady Mara across a table for the first time in 7 months, and had seen what guilt and fear in 3 months of watching a court purge itself of anything that might complicate a story could do to a woman's face. Mara looked older. She looked like someone who had been carrying something too heavy for too long and had finally decided that putting it down was worth whatever happened next. She had provided 3 things: the current guard rotation, a wax impression of the archive seal that would allow Celine to present the secretary's confession as a properly accessed document rather than a stolen one, and the information that Castor had moved 2 additional soldiers to the Coronation Hall's interior positions the moment Mira's intelligence had come in. He was watching the obvious approaches. He was not watching the wool delivery. Nobody watched the wool delivery. That was the thing about power. It created blind spots exactly as large as its own arrogance. The people who controlled a kingdom stopped seeing its seams because they had stopped needing to. The cart stopped. She heard the gate exchange, Dort's steady voice, a guard's routine questions, the particular silence of men performing a function they had performed hundreds of times and found unremarkable. The gate opened. The cart moved through. She was inside the palace walls. She gave it 15 minutes, counting her own heartbeats, before she shifted the fleece and sat up in the back of the cart in the lower storage yard. Dort was already unhitching his horse at the far end and deliberately not looking in her direction. She dropped over the cart's side and moved to the wall. The lower storage corridor was 40 feet of cold stone and hanging tools, and it connected northeast to the supply lifts, and the supply lifts connected to the administrative wing on the 3rd level. She had walked this route in her mind so many times over the past 2 days that moving through it now had the quality of following a groove rather than making choices. She did not run. Running attracted attention. She moved with the particular authority of a person who belongs exactly where they are, which was a quality she had learned in the court and found, with some dark private humor, was still useful. The archive was unlocked. It was always unlocked during Coronation Week. Too many administrative staff moving in and out to make the seal practical. She found the secretary's records in the 4th cabinet from the left, 3rd drawer, flagged with a red cord that Mara had placed there 2 days prior. She opened the document, read it once straight through, and felt the specific sensation of a thing becoming real that you have been treating as theoretical for months. The names were there, the dates, the meetings, the instruction given to the assassin, the payment. All of it in a dead man's careful handwriting, signed and witnessed and then sealed away in an archive where it would never be found because the man who had ordered the sealing was the same man whose name was written at the top of the first page. She folded it inside her jacket, against her skin. Then she heard voices in the corridor outside the archive and went very still. 2 of them. Moving with purpose, not patrol rhythm. She pressed against the cabinet wall and listened to them pass and felt her heart beating in her throat and in her wrists and against the inside of her sternum, and the baby moved low and hard, and she breathed. She had 12 minutes before the coronation ceremony entered its 2nd hour, which was the window Mara had identified as the point of maximum court assembly. Every allied alpha present, every delegation seated, the full witness she needed for what she was about to do. She moved. The ceremonial approach was packed with court staff and delegation members moving between positions, and she walked through the edge of it with her head level and her pace controlled, and she was 20 feet from the entrance arch to the main hall when someone stepped into her path. Renwick, Lord Renwick, second-ranking council member, who she had always assessed as the weaker instrument in Castor's arrangement. Less ambitious, more frightened, the kind of man who served a plan because the consequences of not serving it were too immediate to resist. He looked at her and went the color of old ash. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't call out. Think very carefully about what you do next." His mouth worked. He was looking at her stomach and then at her face, and she could see him running calculations with the trapped speed of a man whose calculations had never included this specific variable. They said you were here," she said. I'm here, and I'm going through that door. The question is whether you're going to step aside or whether you're going to do something that ties your name to Castor's on a very bad night for everyone tied to Castor's name." He looked at the door. He looked at her. He stepped aside. She walked through the arch into the coronation hall. The hall was immense and blazing with light and full of wolves. Delegation alphas in formal colors, council members at their long table, court staff at the periphery, and on the raised dais at the far end, Darius Thorne in his coronation armor with the blood moon crown above his head, and Castor standing 3 feet to his right, and Vivienne, not in her usual court position, but at Castor's left, which was wrong, which was not a ceremonial position, which was the position of someone who had stopped pretending. The ceremony was mid-passage. The officiant's voice rolled over the hall. Heads began turning towards Celine as she walked through the main aisle. She had thought about this moment. She had thought about it the way you think about something that will either work or kill you, with complete attention and zero sentiment. She had thought about what she would feel walking back into this room. Whether the accumulated weight of 7 months would hit her in the chest when she saw Darius's face. She felt almost nothing. Or rather, she felt the thing that had been building since the way station, since the creek tunnel, since the night she sat by a fire and rebuilt a gutted plan with 2 days and damaged materials. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was something colder and more durable than either. She pulled the document from inside her jacket and held it up, and she said, loudly enough that the officiant stopped mid-word, "This proceeding is halted." The hall went to complete silence. "My name is Celine Hartwell," she said, "Luna of the Thorn Kingdom. I have returned to this court with evidence of conspiracy against the crown, including the orchestrated deaths of members of this royal family and the systematic manipulation of its king." She watched Darius find her face in the crowd. She watched Castor's hand move almost imperceptibly toward the soldier at his right. "That document is a forgery," Castor said. His voice came out smooth and immediate, the voice of a man who had rehearsed this. "Produced by a woman who has been declared unstable by this court and who is currently wanted for arson and flight from lawful custody." "It is the confession of Secretary Aldrin Moss," Celine said, addressing the delegation alphas directly. "Written in his own hand 6 years ago, detailing 3 meetings between Lord Castor, Lady Vivienne Ashford, and the man paid to kill King's brother Aldrich Thorne. It is sealed with the archive cord. You can verify the handwriting against any court document from Aldrin Moss's tenure. I'm inviting you to do exactly that." Movement at the hall's edge. Castor's soldiers. Repositioning. She counted them without moving her eyes from the delegations. 4 visible, 2 more near the east pillar. Then the north entrance opened, and Kael came through it with 8 rogue wolves at his back, and the hall's geometry changed. He had promised her the north entrance if she could get inside. He had not told her how many he was bringing because she had not asked, and standing in the coronation hall watching 8 exiled wolves take up positions at the room's perimeter with the specific competence of people who had been fighting without institutional backing for years, she understood that he had not told her because he had known she would tell him it was too many, too dangerous, too visible. He had been right to not tell her. Castor's voice cut across the hall. "Remove the intruder and the rogue pack, by order of the council." Nobody moved. This was the moment Celine had calculated most carefully and trusted least. The moment when the people in this room, the delegation alphas, the court staff, even the palace guard, had to decide which version of events they were going to commit to. Castor had power in this room. He had built it over years, but power built on constructed reality is only as stable as the construction. and she had just put a crack in the wall that everyone present could see. Old Alpharena of Duskfall rose from the delegation table. She was 70 and built like a woman who had survived 3 succession wars and found them only moderately impressive. She looked at the document in Celine's hand and then at Castor. "I'd like to see the document," Reyna said. "It's a forgery." "I'd like to see it." 2 more delegation alphas stood. Castor looked at Vivian. What happened next happened fast. Celine saw Vivian's hand, and she saw what was in it, and she moved, not away, because there was nowhere to move in the packed hall, but toward Darius, which was the only direction that changed the geometry. She heard the sound and felt the air near her left shoulder, and she was still moving when the hall erupted. Vivian had fired at Celine and missed, and the miss had been by less than 6 inches, and the hall was now in chaos. Delegates overturning tables, palace guards splitting between following Castor's commands and responding to the unprecedented sight of a weapon discharged in the coronation hall. Kyle's wolves moving to intercept the soldiers near the east pillar. Celine reached the dais. Darius was 3 feet away and looking at her with an expression she had no category for. Not the cold management face, not the open, undefended thing she had seen with Vivian. Something she had never seen on him before, which was the expression of a man confronting the possibility that the story he had been living was not the story that was true. She put the document in his hands. "Read it," she said. "Read who killed your brother." His hands closed on the paper. He looked at her stomach and then at her face, and she saw the moment the shock arrived in him, the real shock, not of her presence, but of whatever the document contained as his eyes moved down the first page. She heard Vivian's voice behind her, sharp and stripped of its composure for the first time. "It doesn't matter what that says. The child belongs to the council's jurisdiction. The Luna has been declared unfit. The succession protocol is already—" "Shut up," Darius said. His voice came out quiet and absolute. Vivian went silent. He read the second page. Celine stood on the dais of the coronation hall that she had been dragged out of in her mind 100 times. And she felt the first contraction that she could not classify as preparatory, deep and long and taking over her entire torso. And she pressed her hand flat against her stomach and breathed through it and kept her eyes on the hall. Kyle was holding the east line. Rena's wolves had moved to block the south exit, and 3 delegation alphas had physically placed themselves between Vivian and the nearest door, which was a political statement so large it would be written about for a generation. Castor was backing toward the west corridor. He was backing toward the west corridor because the west corridor connected to the private chambers wing, which connected to the exits that weren't exits for most people, but that a man who had spent 40 years in this palace building himself escape routes would have mapped with the same thoroughness she had mapped the north expanse. She looked at Kyle across the width of the hall. He had already seen it. Darius put the document down and looked at Castor. The look on his face was the kind that came after the shock and before whatever decision the shock produced. A specific, undefended, devastating clarity that Celine had seen in only one other context and had thought at the time was love. She understood now it was just what Darius Thorne looked like when he finally, completely, believed something he had been refusing to believe. He stepped off the dais. "Castor," he said. The word landed in the hall like a stone into water, spreading out in every direction. Castor stopped. He turned. His face had the composed, professional quality it always carried, but under it was something Celine had never seen in all her years of watching him work a room. Something that was not quite fear, but was the thing that lives next to fear in people who have been operating a long way past the point where they should have stopped. "My king," Castor said. "My brother," Darius said. Not my brother was innocent. Not my brother didn't deserve. Just the 2 words. The subject and the object. The fact that could not now be put back into the form it had occupied an hour ago. Celine felt the second contraction come, and felt, alongside it, the particular sensation of the floor going liquid beneath her, which was not a contraction. Which was something else. She pressed one hand against the nearest pillar and looked down, and the dark spreading across the stone floor told her something she had been hoping to defer past this moment. She could not defer it. She looked up and found Kyle's eyes across the hall. He was already moving toward her. Behind her, she heard Darius's voice, no longer quiet, no longer controlled, saying Castor's name with every year of grief and trust and manufactured loyalty stripped out of it. And she heard Castor respond with something that was no longer the smooth professional voice of the most trusted advisor in the kingdom, but the flat, finished voice of a man who had decided that if the architecture was coming down anyway, he was going to bring what he could with him. She heard Vivienne say her name. She turned. Vivienne was 10 feet away, and her composure was completely gone. And in its absence was something Celine had never seen in her face. Not the patient triumph of the chamber doorway, not the arranged concern of the corridor audience, but the raw, functional fury of a woman who had spent 7 years building something and was watching it come apart in an hour, and who had located the one person she held responsible. The weapon was raised. Kyle hit Vivienne from the left like a wall, and the shot went into the ceiling, and the hall was moving and shouting, and Celine was sliding down the pillar with both hands pressed flat against her stomach, as the next contraction erased everything else in her world except the immediate physical fact of what her body was doing. The confession was in Darius's hands. The hall had witnessed everything. Whatever happened in the next 5 minutes, the architecture was down. Celine pressed her back against the pillar and looked up at the coronation hall's vaulted ceiling, at the blood moon light coming through the high windows, at the shape of a kingdom deciding in real time what version of itself it was going to be. And she felt the next contraction build and take over, and she did not make a sound. She had come here to end it. She had ended it. Everything after this was whatever came next. The boy came into the world in a side chamber off the coronation hall, on a borrowed cloak spread over cold stone, with Mara holding one of Celine's hands, and a delegation healer who had fought through the chaos to reach her holding the other. It took 40 minutes. It felt longer, and also, in the strange compression that extreme physical experience produces, much shorter. Celine did not make sounds she didn't mean to make. She breathed the way Kyle had taught her to breathe when something hurt badly, and stopping was not an option. Slow in, controlled out, keep the body from deciding the situation was unsurvivable. She kept her eyes open. She wanted to be present for this, completely present, because whatever was happening in the hall beyond the door, this moment belonged entirely to her and to no one else. The boy arrived screaming, good lungs, strong and immediate and furious, as though he had opinions about the circumstances of his entry and intended to register them. Celine lay back on the stone floor and felt the specific total exhaustion that has nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with completion, and she listened to him scream, and something in her chest that had been clenched for 9 months opened. She had been afraid, without fully admitting it, that she would look at him and see Darius. She had been afraid that his face would arrive as a wound. He looked like her mother. The same wide forehead, the same quality of concentrated attention, even in those first raw minutes. The same mouth set in a line that suggested he would have thoughts about things and would not keep them to himself. She held him against her chest and felt his heat and his weight and his absolute demanding aliveness, and she said nothing because there was nothing language was adequate to. Mara was crying quietly at her shoulder. Even the delegation healer looked shaken in the way people look when they have been present at something that reminded them what the word irreducible means. Outside, the sounds from the hall had changed. The initial chaos, the shouting, the movement of soldiers, the specific percussion of a political order coming apart, had shifted into something more structured, commands being issued and followed. The particular organized noise of a situation being contained rather than a situation still in freefall. She had 15 minutes before anyone came through that door with demands. She used them. She held her son and she breathed and she let herself exist in the only moment that was asking nothing of her. She had spent 7 months in motion, physical motion, tactical motion, the constant forward-pushing motion of a woman who understood that stopping meant dying. She had not stopped. She was stopping now for 15 minutes in a side chamber with cold stone under her and a borrowed cloak over her, and the most important thing she had ever done pressed against her sternum, breathing in the quick, shallow rhythm of new life. She was still bleeding and exhausted, and she needed food and water and probably several days of sleep, and she was going to need all of that later. Right now, she just breathed. Kyle came through the door first, which was correct because she had told him that was what she needed. Not a soldier, not a court official, but someone whose presence did not require her to immediately become something other than what she currently was. He looked at the boy, and something moved through his face that she had never seen there before. Not softness exactly, something more complicated. The expression of a man encountering a fact that rearranged other facts around it. "Castor," she said. Contained. 4 council guards switched sides when Darius moved on him. "He's in custody." Cale crouched down to be level with her. His voice was the same as always, even, direct, stripped of performance. "Vivian? She's alive. Reyna's people have her." "Darius?" A pause. Not long, but Cale didn't pause without reason. "He went after Castor personally," Cale said. "Before the guards could reach them, Castor had a blade." She looked at him. "He's alive," Cale said. "He's asking for you." She was on her feet in 3 minutes, which was approximately 2.5 minutes faster than her body had any business permitting. Mara took the boy with an expression that said she understood this was temporary and sacred, and she would not move from that spot. Celine straightened, breathed, and walked back through the door. The coronation hall had the particular quality of aftermath. Bodies moving carefully through wreckage, voices low, the stunned collective recalibration of a room full of people who had come in expecting ceremony and received something else entirely. Delegation alphas stood in clusters. Palace guards had formed a perimeter around the dais. The confession document sat on the main council table with 3 delegation witnesses already standing over it. Celine walked through it all without stopping. Darius was in the antechamber behind the dais, sitting against the wall with a court physician crouched over him. The blade had gone in below his right shoulder, deep enough to matter, not deep enough to be immediately fatal. He was pale and breathing carefully in the way people breathe when breathing hurts, and he was watching the door when she came through it. He looked at her stomach. "The child," he said. His voice came out rougher than she'd ever heard it. "Born. Healthy. A son." Something crossed his face and was gone. "I'm glad." She stood in front of him and looked at him and felt not what she had expected to feel. Not the roiling thing she had carried for 7 months. Not grief or fury or the frozen contempt of a woman who had decided she was done. She felt something quieter and more complicated than any of those. She felt the specific sadness of seeing clearly something you had once loved through a distorting glass and understanding both the love and the distortion simultaneously, and knowing that neither cancels the other out. "Vivian confessed," he said. "Before Kael's people contained her, she confessed, in front of the delegations." He stopped, breathed through something. "She said she never... She was very clear that she never..." He stopped again. "I know," Celine said. "I believed her, for years. I believed everything she..." His jaw tightened. "Aldrich, my brother. I believed the investigation. I believed Castor's account. I believed I was surrounded by people who..." He looked at his hands. "I was a fool." "You were managed," she said. "There's a difference. Not a comfortable one, but a real one." He looked up at her. "Does the difference matter?" She thought about this honestly, the way she had learned to think about things honestly instead of the way she needed them to be. "For the purposes of what comes next," she said, "yes. For the purposes of what's already done, no. Not to me." He was quiet for a moment. "I called you hysterical," he said. "In front of the court." "Yes. In front of our child." "The child wasn't born yet." "You know what I mean." "I do." She looked at him. "I know exactly what you mean, and I know exactly what it cost, and I know what it did. I'm not going to tell you it's all right because it isn't. Some things that happen can't be unmade, and that is one of them, and you're going to carry it, and that's the correct outcome." He received this without flinching, which she noted. It was possibly the most honest thing she had ever seen him do. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Not what do you want. What do you need?" The distinction was small and significant. Castor and Vivian face full tribunal, every allied alpha sitting as witness. No private settlements, no managed outcomes, no version of this that allows anyone to reframe what happened as a domestic incident. She held his gaze. The succession protocol that would have given the council regency over my son dissolved publicly tonight. Done. New law before the next council session. Luna's testimony carries equal standing to the king's in all succession matters. No Luna can be declared unfit without a tribunal that includes representation from her home pack. His eyes were steady. Done. And the burned chamber, she said. Don't rebuild it. He paused at that one. Leave it, she said. Leave it exactly as it is. Let everyone who walks past it know what that room represents, what was built there and what it cost. Don't manage it into something palatable. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, Done. She nodded once. She turned to go. Celine. She stopped. I'm sorry. His voice came out raw in the way of a man who didn't use the word often and was using it now because he had finally run out of alternatives to it. Not as a political calculation. Not because of what you can do to me if I'm not. I'm sorry because I looked at what I had, and I didn't see it. And I looked at what was being built around me, and I didn't see that either. And people are dead because of the second, and you were destroyed because of the first. And I have to live with both of those. She stood with her back to him, and felt the word hit her the way apologies hit when they are genuine. Not with relief, not with the release of something long held, but with a particular grief for all the distance between the word and the situation that produced the need for it. An apology was not a correction. It was an acknowledgement of an uncorrectable thing. It had its own weight and its own worth, and neither of those was the weight or worth of the thing itself. I hear you, she said. She did not say I forgive you. She did not say it's all right. She said the truest thing available. I hear you. And she left him there to do what a man with genuine regret has to do, which is live with it without the relief of absolution. The tribunal took 3 days. It was thorough in the way that things are thorough when the evidence is complete and the witnesses are numerous, and the only remaining question is the form of consequence rather than the fact of guilt. Castor spoke little. Vivian spoke at length, with the exhausting technical precision of a woman who had spent years building an architecture of manipulation and could not, even at the end, resist demonstrating the craftsmanship. She confessed to Aldrich's death. She confessed to the intelligence fabrication that had exiled Kael. She confessed to the campaign against Celine's credibility, conducted with the patient, systemic care of a person who understood that the most effective destruction is the kind the target participates in. She did not express regret. She expressed, with a composure that Celine found genuinely unsettling in its consistency, the view that the plan had been sound, and the execution had been precise, and the only variable she had not adequately accounted for was the degree to which Celine Hartwell would refuse to behave like someone who had been broken. I was broken, Celine said, when Rena asked her directly what she wanted the tribunal to understand. That's important to say clearly. I was broken in that corridor. What I discovered afterward was that broken isn't the same as finished. It just means the form you had before is gone, and you have to find out what you are underneath it. She said it plainly, not for effect. The delegation alphas wrote it down. Castor and Vivian were stripped of titles, lands, and court standing and exiled to the outer territories under permanent watch of the allied Pack Council. Celine had considered harder consequences and had set them aside not from mercy but from something colder. The understanding that making them into permanent, visible examples of accountability served the kingdom's future more than their deaths would, and she was in the business now of the kingdom's future. On the 7th day after the coronation, Celine stood in the council chamber with her son in her arms and formally declined the title of queen. The room went silent. Old Reyna, seated at the delegation table as a transition witness, made a sound that might have been approval or might have been the specific noise a woman makes when she has seen something she did not expect and found it correct. I will serve as regent partner in transition, Celine said, with equal standing on all council decisions until my son reaches majority. At that point, he chooses his own path, advised but not directed. The title of queen implies a hierarchy of position over function. I'm not interested in the hierarchy. I'm interested in the function. The new law was written that afternoon. It took 4 hours and 3 drafts, and the argument of two council members whom Cellini overruled with the specific, quiet authority of a woman who had learned the difference between power that was given and power that was earned, and understood that the earned kind was the only kind that held under pressure. Kael was there for the drafting. He sat at the corner of the table and said nothing for most of it, and when he spoke it was with the same direct economy he applied to everything. Here is the weakness in this clause. Here is how this language will be used against you in 20 years. Here is the actual load-bearing principle underneath the proposed text. She watched him and thought about the quality of trust. She had trusted people before and had been educated comprehensively about the limits of trust built on the wrong foundations. What she had with Kael was built on a different material, not warmth, not affection, not the premise that the other person was good and would remain so. It was built on demonstrated behavior under pressure, on a shared understanding of how institutions failed and why, on the recognition in each other of a particular kind of person the world had tried to use and had instead educated. It was not love yet. She was not sure what it was. She was sure that it was real in the way that things built from accurate understanding are real, durably, weight-bearingly, in a way that did not require maintenance from illusion. She was 39 days out from the coronation when she took her son to the burned chamber. It was a clear morning, cold and bright, the kind of day where the light was absolute and the shadows were sharp-edged. The east wing still smelled faintly of smoke, even after 2 months, in the way that deeply burned structures hold the memory of fire in their bones. The chamber door had been sealed after the investigation and had not been reopened. She opened it. The room was exactly as she had left it. The hearthrug, unrecognizable. The tapestry, a fall of blackened fiber against the scorched wall. The writing desk, collapsed to its metal frame. And on the floor near the center, the remains of the gold gown, burned to nothing structural, a few heavy beads still visible in the ash like seeds. She stood in the doorway with her son against her chest and looked at the room for a long time. She thought about the woman who had stood in this room 7 months ago and set it alight. She did not think about her with contempt or with pity. She thought about her the way you think about an earlier version of yourself when enough time has passed that the distance allows honesty, with recognition, and with the specific compassion that is available only when you are no longer inside the pain you are observing. That woman had been breaking. She had been breaking for months before the fire, under the slow, careful pressure of people who needed her broken, and she had not known it because the breaking had been constructed to feel like her own inadequacy. The fire was the first thing she had done in 3 years that was entirely hers. It was destructive and necessary, and it had cost her everything it was supposed to cost. And standing here now, she understood that she would not take it back. You could not rebuild from a structure that was rotten at the foundation. You had to take it down first. The taking down hurt. That was correct. The hurt was not the evidence that it was wrong. She looked at the beads in the ash. She thought about her mother in the frost-killed garden, hands dirty, hair loose, saying power is what you're willing to lose and survive anyway. She had lost everything she had walked into this palace carrying, the love she had believed in, the position she had performed herself into, the version of herself that had needed to be chosen and found sufficient by someone whose choosing she had given authority over her own worth. She had survived it. She had survived it and come back and pulled the architecture down from the inside. And she was standing here in the ruins of the room where it began with her son in her arms and a kingdom that needed to be rebuilt on different foundations. She was not happy in any simple sense of the word. Happiness was not what this was. What this was harder and more durable than happiness. It was the particular satisfaction of a person who had been tested against the worst available version of their circumstances and had learned what they were made of underneath everything they had believed they needed. She was made of the North, of frost-cracked soil and border territory winters, and a mother who knew the difference between what they told you and what was true. She was made of 3 years of accumulated small humiliations that she had processed as the cost of love, and could now read as the education they actually were. She was made of creek tunnels in the dark, and rebuilt plans and the cold, structural intelligence of a woman who had stopped needing the premise that people were good in order to move forward. She was made of the fire. The boy made a sound against her chest. Not unhappy, exploratory, the sound of an infant encountering a new sensory input and registering it without judgment. She looked down at him and found him looking at the room with the concentrated attention that she now understood was simply what his face did. "This is where we started," she told him quietly. "Remember what it looks like." She did not mean it as a threat or a wound to carry. She meant it as a foundation, the honest starting point from which everything else was built. There was no strength worth having that didn't know its own origin, and the origin of everything they were going to build together, this child, this kingdom, this different way of holding power, was here, in a burned room, in the ash of a gold gown that had never fit correctly anyway. She turned and walked away from the chamber and did not close the door behind her. Cale was in the corridor. He did not ask how it had gone. He looked at her face and read the answer there, the way she had learned he read most things, without requiring translation, with the attention of a person who had spent years in circumstances where misreading the available information had immediate consequences. He fell into step beside her. They walked down the corridor and out through the east wing into the pale winter light, and the palace spread around them in all its complicated, compromised, still-standing weight, and the kingdom beyond it was doing what kingdoms do in the days after a reckoning. Cautiously, incrementally, with the particular tentativeness of institutions that have been reminded they are not permanent but have decided to continue anyway. There was so much work to do. She knew the full inventory of it, and it was not small. New law, new council structure, accountability mechanisms that would outlast this specific moment of clarity and function in the dull, ordinary years when no one was paying close attention. Protections for the smaller packs that had been managed and margined and used as political material for decades. An exile community that deserved the restoration of standing, starting with one specific exiled alpha who had been right about an Eastern Village campaign 4 years ago and had paid the full price of being right too early. She knew the inventory. She was not daunted by it. She had been broken and had found out what she was made of underneath. She had rebuilt a plan with 2 days and damaged materials. She had ridden north pregnant and alone and come back to the capital carrying everything she needed. She could do the work. The burned chamber stayed open behind her, the cold light moving through its empty doorway, and the ash of the gold gown settled in the silence, and the beads lay still in the gray quiet, like the last evidence of a woman who had stood in that room and made a choice that cost everything. The cost had been real. What had been built from it was also real. And Celine Hartwell, not Luna, not Queen, not the function she had been imported to perform, walked into the winter light with her son against her chest, and her stride unhurried and her eyes open. And she did not look back, and she was not the same woman who had set the fire. She was what the fire had made,